Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today's presentation is in partnership with our friends at the National Trust for Scotland, USA. Scotland is one of the oldest nations in the world, yet by some definitions, it is hardly counted as a nation at all. Neither a colony of England nor a fully equal partner in the British Union, Scotland's history has often been seen as simply a component of part of the British history. But the story of Scotland is one of innovation, exploration, resistance, and global consequence. Today, author and historian Murray Pittock will discuss his most recent work, Scotland, the Global History, 1603 to the Present, and the country's place in the world. From the 30 Years' War to the Jacobite risings and today's ongoing independence debates, Scotland and its diaspora have undergone profound changes. Professor Pittock's groundbreaking account reveals the diversity of Scotland's history and shows how, after the country disappeared from the map as an independent state, it continued to build a global brand. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch anytime you like. Murray Pittock is a Scottish historian, Bradley Professor of Literature at the University of Glasgow, and Pro-Vice Principal at the university. His books include Enlightenment in a Smart City, Edinburgh's Civic Development, The Myth of the Jacobite Clans, and Robert Burns in Global Culture. In naming Scotland, the Global History as the Spectator's 2022 History Book of the Year, William Dalrymple described it thus: spectacularly panoramic and sweeping while always remaining vigorously scholarly, as admirably frank about Scotland's participation in the slave and opium trade and the looting of half the globe as it is about the country's contribution to finance, technology, and innovation that drove the steam age. He has made a major contribution to the field. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pittock.
Thank you very much, Curt, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining me from wherever you are in the United States this afternoon for you. This is an account of some of the aspects of the global history, but I'm going to be focusing on the global history in North America because there's rather a lot of the global history. And in doing that, I'm going to be looking particularly at some of the places in Scotland with full reference to the National Trust for Scotland USA Foundation that you can still visit, which are connected to some of the themes about Scotland and North America I'll be talking about today. That's the book which you can get, which is $40, but a paperback is due soon. Just to should you feel the need to read it in more depth later on. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to start with the Jacobites, which is and we're going to start in the military side of Scotland's connections to North America. And what you're seeing there is the Glenfinnan Monument, which was put up in the early 19th century, officially to commemorate the Jacobites, but actually probably to partly commemorate the role of the Scottish Highland regiments in the Napoleonic Wars. And the figure on the top, which you can just see in outline, is Charles Edward Stuart, born Prince Charlie, who was added 15 years after the monument itself went up. This spot was where the Jacobite army raised the standard on the 19th of August, 1745. Within less than a month, they were in Edinburgh, where 20,000 greeted the entry of the Prince's army. 4 days after they entered Edinburgh, they defeated the British Army in Scotland under Sir John Cope and Preston Pans. 3 days after that, they began to raise taxes at the old Scottish, the pre-1707 Scottish rate throughout Scotland. And a run began on the Bank of England only a week after the Battle of Preston Pans, which was held at bay eventually in its latter stages by the Bank of England paying out in sixpences. When we think about the Jacobites, we think about Scotland in 1745-46, maybe we think about Jamie Fraser and Outlander, which helps to bring almost 500,000 people to this spot every year. But there are also a lot of other people we should be thinking of. And two examples that I'm going to give you before we move on to the battle that ended the Jacobite Rising are General James Oglethorpe, who was, although he was in the British Army, was of a Jacobite family and was regarded as having failed to pursue with his cavalry the Jacobite retreat from Derby in late 1745 with sufficient vigor, and as a result was court-martialed in 1746. And when Oglethorpe, he was acquitted, there wasn't enough evidence to find him guilty, but nonetheless he was court-martialed. When Oglethorpe joined the senior ranks of the British service, one of the first things he was commissioned to do was, of course, to set up colonial administration in Georgia in the 1730s. And in doing that, he brought over a large number of Jacobites who in their turn had fought in the rising of 1715. One of Oglethorpe's colonists, Lachlan MacGillivray, married the Creek noblewoman Sihon Marchand, and their son, Alexander MacGillivray, became a Creek chief. And just as Oglethorpe initially came to Georgia to create a buffer state between the existing American colonies and Spanish-controlled Florida and Central America, so Alexander MacGillivray came as a Creek leader to play off both Spain and the infant United States against each other in a kind of reprise of Oglethorpe's own policies in the 1730s and 40s, but this time representing Native Americans rather than either Great Britain or Spain. And as we move on to the next slide, we'll see the images from the end of the Jacobite Rising if you were to visit the battlefield of Culloden, where the rising ended on the 16th of April, 1746. There are two shots of the battle. One of them is, and it's still a wonderful and very atmospheric space. One of them is shows the Murray Firth, where the Royal Navy were watching the entire battle, and one of the reasons that the night attack on Cumberland's camp that occurred the night before that battle wasn't successful was that they couldn't set off. It was Scotland in the middle of April, and they couldn't set off until it was getting quite late in the evening because they were in full sight of the Royal Navy in the Murray Firth. And the other slide shows how it's slightly distorted because that is the view from the Jacobite far right towards the Jacobite left, which, as you can see, is uphill, and the Jacobite right could not see the Jacobite left on that day at Culloden, the day that ended the Jacobite Rising of 1746 and started one of the most important chapters in the connection of Scotland to North America. And as we'll see in the next slide, that battle itself was a representation of many of the conflicts that had already occurred in the British Empire and between the British Empire and France. Many of those who stood on both sides in that day, again, it's a global conflict. It's not a conflict simply of clans or local families against British regiments. Many of those who stood in the field that day had stood only a year earlier at both sides of the battle at Fontenoy between the British forces and the French forces. Most of the front line of the British forces had fought in the front lines at Fontenoy, and most of the front line and second line of the Jacobite, many of the front and second line of the Jacobite forces had also been in the field that day, particularly the Irish pickets, who are on the left as you're looking towards this, and the Royal Scots, the French regulars, who are on the right. The battle remains one of the decisive battles of the world, even though it was and changed the history of the world, even though it was so relatively small, with only about 13,500 to 14,000 men engaged on both sides. And the reasons for that are that the defeat of the Jacobites, and Culloden was their final defeat in 1746, the defeat of the Jacobites led to an unequivocal outcome of the unification of the British Isles under the Hanoverian monarchy, which was no longer challenged. If the Jacobites had won, it's likely that there would have been sufficient rapprochement with France for the 7 Years' War not to have taken place. If the 7 Years' War had not taken place, then there's at least a chance that because the French would have remained in such strength in Canada, that the American colonies would not have felt able to rebel with such a strong Catholic power to the north of them in 1776. And there's also more than a chance that France would not have spent so much money in fighting in the second and third quarters of the 18th century that they were unable to deal with the agricultural disruptions and crop failure of the 1780s, which led to the French Revolution and hence Napoleon. There is no question that the final defeat of the Jacobites altered the balance of power on the continent, and therefore, because of the nature of French and British power, altered the balance of power in the world. And as we move on to the next slide, we'll see a couple of those of the rather lovely Doon Celtic design pistols, some of the earliest aspects of Celtic design, which were used by Jacobite forces on that fatal day. And if we move to the next slide, we'll see some of the aftermath as it affected Scotland. One of the things I wanted to look at this is a map of the British Army's occupation of Scotland from 1746 to 55. The orange images are fortifications, castles, forts, and fortified barracks. The purple ones are of long-term camps, and the yellow ones are of temporary camps. Though the GIF here runs from 1746 to 46-7 through to 1755. But one of the most important things to notice about it is if anyone thinks they know about the Jacobite period, what they would normally think of is that perhaps the Highlands were the area that was occupied. Perhaps it was in the Highlands of Scotland that there was most concern about future rebellion. But in fact, as you can clearly see, in some ways, the West Highlands of Scotland were the least occupied, and the whole of Scotland, most of central and lowland Scotland too, is under occupation. And it proves very difficult during this period, during these 9 years, to move on British forces. They try to rotate them, they try to move them out, they try to run down the number of troops available, but it doesn't altogether work until it's decided to start recruiting large numbers of Scots directly into the British Army, and the kilt is can only be worn legitimately in British regiments, which of course is already the case by the mid-1750s for the Black Watch, but becomes the case for a whole range of other Scottish regiments which start to be raised in 1755. And it's only in 1755 that the numbers of British troops in Scotland begin to fall very heavily indeed. And as we'll see in the next slide, one of the consequences of this 9-year occupation was a struggle between the politicians and the military. The military wanted to depopulate areas of Scotland they thought were disaffected and were going to be Jacobite for the foreseeable future. And a limited version of this was practiced in some areas in Lochaber and Morven in the West Highlands. It was supported by not only by senior generals on Cumberland's staff, but even by the President of the Court of Session in Scotland, Lord President Fergus. However, the politicians opposed it, and the politicians opposed the transplantation of populations because ultimately this was a union. They were British subjects. They haven't been found guilty in a court of law. So the military kept on pressing for this, and the politicians kept on resisting it. And Cumberland as commander-in-chief after 1755 was very influential. So eventually, the British Army got its way, and depopulation became implemented into British policy. It remained part of British military policy as late as the Malayan emergency and the war in Kenya in the 1950s and 60s. And arguably the movement of the Chagosian Islanders from Diego Garcia in 1973 was the last example of it. But the first example was what was called Le Grand Arrangement, which led to the forcible expulsion of almost all the 14,000 French settlers in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island to make way for Anglophones. Cumberland's policies at last could be put into effect with the backing rather than the opposition of the politicians. And as Cumberland himself said, he looked forward to the French being drove out of Acadia, Nova Scotia, as he'd once hoped to do in Lochaber. And in the next slide, we'll see just what the effect of that was. From Acadie here in today's Canada, you can see the movements towards the New England colonies in brown, the movements from France, France in green, which led to the depopulation, which is in brown, or their subsequent French immigration waves in there after the depopulation, moves towards Louisiana, South America, the Caribbean, and Saint-Pierre et Miquelon also. This was, although small scale by the standard of today's refugee crises, an example of what happens when populations are displaced. Large scale population and even small scale population displacement has a huge knock-on effect. And the Acadian population, the French-speaking population in Nova Scotia, spread across Western Europe and North America as a consequence of their expulsion. So you can see already that from a very small spot, because the battlefield of Culloden itself is hardly half a mile by 3/4 of a mile, huge changes were beginning to take place in the Atlantic world as a direct consequence of the policies formulated in the aftermath of the Jacobite defeat on that day in April 1746. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the treatment of post-Culloden prisoners, because the Acadians were far from the only people who were moved around. Although mass depopulation didn't happen, quite a lot of people were convicted of being part of the Jacobite Rising, and in a rather doubtful move from the point of view of judicial process, a number of those held in prison basically were forced to volunteer to pardon on enlistment by joining the British Army. So they didn't know that probably the state couldn't get round to trying them because the courts were full. So they were offered the alternative enlisting for the British Army, and we'd forgive and forget, except that when they did enlist for the British Army, they were normally enlisted in regiments going to the West Indies, which means that they would have a very high mortality rate. So this was a way of killing them off. And those who were actually convicted and transported, who hadn't already died in the holding hulks on the Tilbury, where the mortality rate was 70%. Some 1,000 were transported to the West Indies and North America, and they were typically sold for their 7 years indentured service for £5 at the quayside on their arrival. And you can get from most of the passenger lists or the transportee lists we don't have, but we can get in this post-Jacobite era from liberated in the Veteran off Martinique, a list of those who were liberated by French ship from the Veteran, which was transporting them to Jamaica. George Keith, an Aberdeen shoemaker who served in the Garage Regiment, William Bell, a bookseller from Berwickshire. Interestingly, quite a collection of women who seemed to be attached to the regiment of their husband or boyfriend or whatever, were also transported quite often with them. So there's a significant, not a very large, but significant movement to North America and the Caribbean of people like this in the immediate aftermath of Culloden. And there's also a Jacobite move to Europe, in the sense that between 500 and 1,000 Jacobites from Scotland moved to Europe, moved to France to serve in one of the 3 regiments currently in the Jacobite service. And although we're going to talk a little bit about enslavement, and I've talked a little bit about indentured labor, one of the interesting things is that from Scotland at the time, in a time of unrest and disruption, there was a lively trade in selling usually young boys for plantation work in the West Indies, who were kidnapped off the streets by merchants, 500 in Aberdeen in district in the 5 years before Culloden alone, and transported overseas for sale on arrival. So not all of global Scotland was voluntary by any means. But now I think we're in the next slide, we're going to start to look at some of the places which are core to that global footprint of Scotland in the United States and Canada. So the first place we're going to look at is a lovely building built by John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, who started his career as page to Prince Charles Edward Stuart in 1745, was let off effectively because he was 15 or 16, became a British administrator as governor of New York, Virginia, and then the Bahamas, and of course, created on the eve of the American Revolutionary War the offer of emancipation to enslaved persons who would enlist in the Ethiopian Regiment of British Volunteers, the first black regiment raised in the service of the Crown, the sash of the uniform bearing the words "Liberty to Slaves." So Dunmore, who starts his career from a Jacobite family, who starts his career as a Jacobite, becomes a British administrator and also becomes an opponent of the American colonies in the War of Independence, but an opponent rather awkwardly for those American colonies by the creation of the Ethiopian Regiment of British Volunteers on the promise of emancipation. And here is his building, a building which was a statement of Scotland's global pretensions and ideas. The power fruit of the era made in stone, as we'll see in the next slide. That's the pineapple on the left, which was built on Dunmore's orders between the 1750s and early 1760s, and symbolizes the status. It's the status of Dunmore's family, its ability to afford exotic fruits like this. The status of the pineapple itself as a symbol of power in 18th century Scotland, partly because it's a symbol of wealth, but also because it's a symbol of cosmopolitanism, overseas connections. A person who knows where to get pineapple before Walmart exists is a person who has got strong trading links throughout the world, is at the center of a network, and is a person of authority, taste, and cosmopolitanism. So there on the left is what becomes an incipient symbol of Dunmore's role as a British colonial administrator and global Scot, while on the right, and that is only 2 miles away from the pineapple on the Forth Coast, are the site of the 18-pounder guns that the Jacobites used to control shipping on the 4th in 1745-46. The late 18th century and the mid 18th century, Dunmore's youth and his middle age side by side with each other, hardly more than a mile or two apart. But the pineapple is still a very striking image when you go and see it, if you do go and see it, and there's some lovely walks nearby. We'll move on to something else in the next slide. Brodick Castle. Now, here is, I'm going to go, having gone almost towards the end of the 18th century, we're just going to go back a bit. Because this is a castle associated with Lord Archibald Hamilton, who for 6 years served as governor of Jamaica until he was alleged to have misappropriated funds and connived at piracy. Misconduct in public office, real or alleged, is nothing new. But one of the things that Hamilton was accused of was raising a Jacobite fleet in the Caribbean because of the large number of Jacobite vessels or Jacobite named vessels which were involved in pirate fleets in the golden age of piracy, partly because the English government, as it then was in the 1690s, had withdrawn letters of marque allowing the creation of privateers, which had been issued by James II, who had, of course, been deposed in 1689, partly because the Jacobite flag became a flag of convenience from which to challenge the East India trade on Madagascar and elsewhere, and particularly in the Caribbean colonies, which are so economically important because of sugar and slavery to the European powers in the 18th century. And some of the names of the ships sailing in the Caribbean at that time, Royal James, King James, Ormond, Queen Anne's Revenge, and New King James, hardly leave much room for doubt of where the sympathies of their pirate crews lay. And indeed, a former Royal Naval captain, George Cammock, planned an alliance between the Jacobite court and the pirates in the Bahamas to seize Bermuda and cut off the West Indies and West African trade. It was not adopted by the Jacobite court, but he was a very serious seaman and later commanded the Barcelona squadron for the Royal Spanish Navy. And I think in the next slide we see Brodick, a beautiful and peaceful place. And once again, the strange thing about Scotland is that in some ways we have the palm trees, the Gulf Stream here, as Ginevra pointed out to me yesterday. But it's always a very small space, and what looks like a very native space is actually rooted to a global impact on the other side of the world, and one which still, in the sense the golden age of piracy, is an absolute shoo-in as a subject for films and dramas, and one doesn't need to be Johnny Depp or receive his paycheck to know that, is intimately connected with the prospect of dealing with pirates and running agreements with pirate fleets, as we'll see some relics of in the next slide. So leaving aside Assassin's Creed, we have Captain Kidd on the left, a Scottish Jacobite privateer who didn't change sides quickly enough to avoid being hanged at Execution Dock in 1701, and perhaps the most famous of them all, William Teach Blackbeard, whose Queen Anne's Revenge, again very clearly showing his political sympathies, was of course salvaged from shallow waters and reconstructed in the United States only a few years ago, as well as, of course, Teach's own career serving for some of the basis of games like Assassin's Creed. So here we are, all over the world and in the Americas, a global footprint for the Jacobites and for Archibald Hamilton as one of the most senior governors involved in allegedly casting a blind eye towards the development of Jacobite power in the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy. And we're staying, I think, on the military metaphor. because we're now moving to the River Tay at Aberfeldy. And when the bridge over the River Tay in Aberfeldy was created in the 1720s, and later on, when the British Army was occupying Scotland, a marker was put up in the 1740s saying, this is the furthest that Rome ever got, brackets, we got further. So they very much had a look back to the classical period. This is a Victorian monument, but it commemorates the assembling of the Black Watch on the banks of the River Tay, the furthest that the Romans ever got. And it does so by a list of their battle honors, which is being inscribed by a man in 19th century Black Watch uniform on the side of the monument. And on the top of the monument is actually one of the Black Watch mutineers who was executed in 1743 for refusing to serve overseas. And in a strange way, it both commemorates the stand of the mutineers who refused to serve overseas in the 1740s, and also the wonderful things, if that's your bag, that the Black Watch achieved in terms of their battle honors overseas by the time this statue went up about 130 years later. It symbolizes, in other words, two things. It symbolizes Scotland's resistant Jacobite past. You can see the man on the top is really dressed as a clansman, and it also symbolizes Scotland's Victorian military successes. And this is very much the military side of what I'm discussing today. And I think it's probably time for the next slide. So this is intimately linked to what I was discussing. I'll go over this quite briefly, about 1755 and the ability to end the occupation of Scotland by recruiting and moving Scottish troops at scale to other theatres, particularly to North America. So, and their presence was critical. For example, I'm not going to read all of this out, but for example, at Quebec, Captain Donald MacDonald of Fraser's regiment, who had formerly been a captain in the Royal Scots, deceived the French sentry to reach the Plains of Abraham and secure passage to the British Army because he could speak French perfectly. And of course, the Scots were recruited to fight in the 1756-63 war, particularly after the British defeat on Monongahela in 1755. But the casualty rates they suffered were enormous. At Ticonderoga, the Black Watch lost 50% of its men. At Duquesne, the Montgomerys almost 60%, and in the Caribbean campaign, also 60%. They might not count as Jacobites anymore, but getting a lot of them killed was certainly probably still a good idea. Putting them up front was very much a characteristic of those campaigns. But meanwhile, there are different kinds, or very different kinds, of Jacobite and former Jacobite Scots present in North America. I mentioned Lachlan MacGillivray earlier as a Creek chief, and his descendants. One of the things, there are quite a number of Scottish chiefs of Native American tribes. Perhaps John Ross of the Cherokee, paramount chief of the Cherokee, is the most prominent and famous. But the interesting thing about MacGillivray was that he had a significant number of descendants who also became subordinate chiefs, or senior warriors, such as William Weatherford, who with Peter McQueen led the brutal American Indian attack on American settlers at Fort Mims in 1813. And Scots as a whole were 4 times as likely to marry Native Americans as other settlers in North America. And one of the interesting things that occurred there, and there's some, I haven't got some of the sales figures from the United States, but the sales figures at Fort Vancouver in the early 19th century are extremely indicative of the extent to which First Nations, Native American peoples bought large amounts of tartan, particularly in red, and particularly using both blue bonnets and Glengarry caps, which they described sometimes, at any rate, as the uniform of their brother Scotches. So the interesting confluence between Scottish and Native American culture is at the same time occurring at roughly the same time as the confluence between Scottish and British imperial culture. But that doesn't end, as we'll see in the next slide, the role of Scotland in the development of the United States. So overall in this period, around about 90 to 100,000 Scots have gone to North America, the majority of them between 1763 and 75. 10 to 15% of the inhabitants of the Carolinas, Georgia, Virginia were Scots by 1790, and they controlled, certainly until the end of the Revolutionary War, over 50% of colonial tobacco. Almost all the medical profession were Scottish graduates, and a quarter of all university graduates in the original United States were Scottish university graduates. And there was, of course, a very strong link between Scotland and the United States, even at this stage. Benjamin Franklin's repeated visits to Scotland, the second of which, of course, David Hume gave a dinner party in his honor in 1771. The early presence in what was to become the United States of extensive Scottish St. Andrews societies, later joined by Caledonian societies and Borns clubs, predominantly in the 19th century, but St. Andrews societies. And the fact that, despite the fact that Scots were often reputed to be more likely to be loyalists, the fact that some high-profile votes, such as the 1776 vote of the St. Andrews Society of Charleston, were more than 2 to 1 in favor of the Patriots. This is, of course, the day after Tartan Day, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much, except to note that I think it's at least that although Tartan Day was initially founded in Nova Scotia in 1987, and of course set up in the United States by Trent Lott's Senate Resolution 155 11 years later, the connection between the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Arbroath, is quite a thin one. I think it's possibly there, but some people don't think it's there at all. The links, however, to Francis Hutcheson, if a mother country attempts anything oppressive towards a colony and the colony is able to subsist as a sovereign state, the colony is not bound to remain subject any longer. And there are many other Hutcheson quotes to the same effect. Those are, I think, very pertinent. However, we have to note that there is one paraphrase of Arbroath amid the founding fathers, and that is James Wilson's essential liberty, which we are determined not to lose, but with our lives, which is very close to Arbroath's. It is not in truth for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. So those are three roles of Scots around the foundation of the United States. And we'll move on in the next slide to a little bit more consideration of that, in the sense that Jacobite exiles fought on both sides, that founding fathers, particularly Jefferson's Rudiments of Latin and Greek actually quotes it, refer to the Scottish grammarian Thomas Ruddiman's Rudiments, which were usually used in the study of classics throughout the 19th century, and the extent of the tensions which drove Scots both to support and to oppose the American Revolution were often driven by economic factors, particularly the exposure to funding from Scotland, which many Scots in the Chesapeake had. But one of the interesting accidents of this war is that there was still a Scots staple, a Scots port with protected status within the Dutch Republic. And in 1780, the Scots staple in Veer declared it was neutral in the war between Great Britain and the United States. And as partly as a consequence of that war, the Scots Brigade, which had remained an independent part of the Dutch army up to that point, had to, because of the Netherlands' support for the United States, be incorporated formally into the Dutch army in 1782. So these impacts are truly right across the European powers as well as North America. And as we'll see in the next slide, there are also influences not of military, political, or economic power, but of the imagination. And partly imagination is stimulated by political, military, and economic power. Of course, there have been so many imaginations and representations of the United States struggle for independence, of which George Lucas's apparently endless Star Wars franchise is only perhaps the most recent in popular culture. But there's also the fact that nostalgia as a term first appears in significant use in English in the context of the First Global War, the 7 Years' War, which with up to 1 million casualties worldwide. And in the heart of that war, this man on the left, James Macpherson, presented to the world a set of poems which he claimed were original and were in part, but were extensively paraphrased by him and put into the context of a contemporary language of enlightenment and sensibility, a story of the heroic nature of Scotland in a far-off age, which instantly resonated across the world. It's part of the development of the ideas of nationality and nationalism that we now have. The translation of Ossian into French, Russian, and Polish followed on from its even earlier link to Corsican nationalism. In Germany, the Ossian poems were part of the language of reunification, and we'll see some of the ways in which they affected the French imaginary in the next slide or two. And Ossian was found in the voice of the creation of the Swiss patriot mountaineer. The cult of William Tell belongs to the 1790s, celebrated not inordinately long after that in Rossini's opera of the same name, and the creation of epics rather like Macpherson's Ossian in Die Holländische Nacht in 1812, and of course the Finnish Kalevala in 1835. And one of the interesting things is that one of the officers in Scotland who have been responsible for the occupation of the British Army in Scotland in the 1740s and 50s created a folly in the Murray Estates in Perthshire, which is now known as the Hermitage, but which became known as Ossian's Hall in 1783. And if we can move on to the next slide. This is the Hermitage, and there was some Ossianic designs were painted in it towards the end of the 18th century, but it was seen in the wake of Ossian not as a folly in a beautiful spot, but actually instead as a sign and symbol of a country, an ancient country in touch with nature in a way that modern, decadent, if you like, societies weren't. This was the world of Ossian. This was the world of Celtic atavism. This was the ground zero of the development of the warrior and liberty-loving, I would not say libertarian, liberty-loving spirit of the global Scot. All a story, all a myth, but still a beautiful spot that you can visit just off the A9 between Perth and Inverness. And if we turn to the next slide, we can see there is some of the Ossianic images on the side of the Hermitage, and there is the view outside if you don't open the door, if, for example, it's raining, but a gorgeous view. And if you move on to the next slide, this is what nobody knew the name of until 1774 on Staffa, cared for now as the whole of Staffa is by the National Trust of Scotland, but is Fingal's Cave. So rather interestingly, rather like the Hermitage, which was after all a building built in the 1750s, but the location of the Hermitage, here is a dark one place which is faintly redolent of a medieval hall with its columns and heavy vertical and what appear to be heavy vertical paneling, which are of course just rock formations, and the water in the middle, showing the idea of journey into the heart of the mountain, movement, a place of origins, a place of beginnings, a kind of rocky womb for, once again, the spirit of the Celt, the spirit of a warlike, liberty-loving Scotland. But of course, this was never known as Fingal's Cave until it was dubbed so by the men in the boat who took over Thomas Pennant to visit it in 1774. So the mythologization of the Scottish landscape and the globalization of the Scot in the third quarter of the 18th century very much go hand in hand. And I think you can look at the next slide now. This is just a tribute not to Scotland, but how Ossian struck the French imaginary. So on the left-hand side of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' dream, sorry, the right-hand side of Auguste Dominique Ingres' dream of Ossian. Ossian as a kind of as a space of poetic contemplation from which rise the classical wars, the classical epics, a space that lies before even Homer. And on the left, Ossian receiving the ghosts of the French heroes by Anne-Louis Girardet in 1801. Ossian associated with French Revolution and French revolutionary violence and idealism. Once again, the source of all that is martial and liberty-loving. It is no wonder that Napoleon slept with a copy under his pillow. But this wasn't, as we'll see in the next slide, the only contribution of Scotland to the national imaginary in this, the global imaginary in this period. Here again is Burns's birthplace, known I'm sure to many of you, where the poet was born in 1759, and which became a locale of global significance as it remains. It's the most visited, the museum and cottage complex are the most visited writers' museum in Great Britain today. And as we'll see in the next slide, they're not the only places we need to think about Burns in the context of. Burns probably came across this medallion, the Wedgwood anti-slavery medallion, first produced in 1786-7 in an abolitionist set of abolitionist rallies in Dumfriesshire in 1792. Am I not a man and a brother? That famous legend. And from it, Burns wrote what was to become, adopted by Frederick Douglass and others, one of the key anthems of the abolitionist movement, is there for honest poverty, with its refrain that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. So it seemed from a coincidental acquaintance with an English ceramics manufacturer's abolitionist medal, Burns created a poem of universal human brotherhood used widely by the abolitionist movement in the United States and elsewhere. And as we'll see in the next slide, also created, as we all know, one of the longest lasting, edited rather than created, it might be fair to say, but he did a lot of editing on it. One of the longest lasting songs of our era, and certainly well reputed to be the second most sung song in the world after Happy Birthday. But from Auld Lang Syne's first singing, and it's first used at a Burns supper as far as we can tell in Philadelphia in 1818, to its first description as a New Year's song by Andrew White in the 1820s. It's being sung by the enslaved in the Caribbean, and then its more formal incorporation into the British military imaginary by the Navy and by the Army, and then its use in American politics, and then its use to regularly close Burns suppers by the late 19th century, its popularization for radio by Guy Lombard at Roosevelt Hotel, and then its effortless move into popular culture. First, I think, used in the talkies in Holiday in 1938, and then, of course, in a succession of famous films, and even becoming a Christmas number in It's a Wonderful Life, and performed not just in Burns suppers, but frequently today at, for example, Taiwanese funerals or the closing of Japanese supermarkets and bars. A global song with a global resonance, and now indelibly associated in American popular culture with New Year, and also with romance, because it is, after all, though I haven't got time to go into that, a romantic song. But just to move to the next slide, one of the things which is interesting about Burns, beyond both Auld Lang Syne and Man's a Man for All That, is he's used in American politics for a very early date. Burns verse is used as an anti-Quincy Adams satire in the 1828 presidentials, and John Anderson, My Joe, becomes a Lincoln campaign song in 1860, used so frequently that Lincoln is actually depicted in a kilt by Vanity Fair in 1861. And of course, Burns, as I did a podcast with Ian Houston on this for the White House Historical Association in January last year, was very, very strongly adopted and a source of interest throughout his life to Lincoln, and partly also partly to mark its own Union war dead. Edinburgh became the first place to erect a Lincoln statue outside the United States in Calton Hill in 1893, by which stage Mary Todd Lincoln and Jefferson Davis had both, before the end of the 1860s, gone to visit Burns' birthplace in Scotland, because one of the ironies of Burns, despite Mark Twain's asseveration that the Civil War was a war between Scott and Burns, one of the ironies of Burns was that he was almost as popular among the Confederate leaders as he was among the leaders of the Union. And if you just move on to the next slide to show you a little bit of the slice of the 10 million people who attend notified or official Burns suppers every year. There are many more, of course, small and domestic events. On the left, we have Todd Wong in Burns supper outfit, the founder of Gung Haggis Fat Choi, the combined Burns supper and Chinese New Year celebration, which began in Vancouver about 25 years ago and has since spread to various locations. It's in Seattle now in the US, but to various other locations in Canada and the US. On the right, you have the Khartoum Caledonian Society Burns Supper. I've always rather thought twice about the possibility of addressing the Khartoum Caledonian Society Burns Supper in recent years, but it still maintains its regular and extremely diverse imprint of the celebration of Burns, even in countries with a great deal of tension and conflict during the Burns season. And below is an altogether more what we call douce affair, a very, very upmarket and civil affair, and that is in the Masonic Hall in Frankfurt by the European Central just beside the European Central Bank. And it is a Burns supper there is a feast day for the great and the good of Germany, principally, and also happens to end with a ceilidh, at which a dance at which the ladies of the Frankfurt Scottish Country Dance Society lead you through your paces. And in true German style, and I have told them this, in true German style, they absolutely ensure that you get everything right, or you get your head to play with, as it were, as we would say in Scotland. Anyway, I've been asked by them before, have you ever danced this dance before? And I've been dancing since the age of 8. So you can be absolutely sure they'll keep you on the straight and narrow. Such is the diversity of Scottish culture in the shape of the Burns Supper across the world today. And I think we may be nearing the end of this conversation. Some of those, these are all National Trust of Scotland sites we looked at: Glenfinnan, Culloden Battlefield, the Pineapple, Brodick Castle, the Hermitage, Fingles Cave on Staffa, and the Burns Birthplace, a museum. And I really look forward to being able to answer some of your questions now as I close this very brief overview of several different kinds of military, imaginative, and other engagement of Scotland with the concerns, politics, and society of the United States in its birth and its ongoing life. Thank you.
Good grief, Murray. That was incredible. For those of you who haven't gotten the book, I highly recommend it. In preparation for today's event, I've been actually reading the book, and I have read a lot a lot of books on Scotland. I have never come across such an amazing compendium of such dense facts, so well presented. So I cannot recommend the book more highly. I also want to say, before we get to your questions, that we have a number of upcoming programs that I would like to mention that shockingly involve me. We're doing a lecture actually a week from today on April 14th on neoclassical Berlin, which was a highlight of a virtual tour I did there in 2016. And by strange coincidence, we're actually doing a tour of Berlin this Christmas called A German Christmas. That sort of mimics a lot of the very same places. And I've just finished working on that this morning, and I'm actually rather pleased with the result. And speaking of Scotland, this May 31st to June 6th, in fact, we have a heritage tour coming up of houses of the Scottish borders that I'll be leading. And my favorite place of Scotland is the borders. The houses there are spectacular. I can't say enough good things about them. And we have, I think, just 4 spaces left on that tour. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time provided. I have to say, we'll start off, Murray, with a number of people involving the word Jacobite. So this is a 2-part question. First of all, can you tell people what Jacobites are? And secondly, someone has asked, do you spend a lot of time in your book on the Jacobite cause?
So if you want to read me on the Jacobite cause, probably better going in detail to other books. There is a bit of time on it because it's a world historical movement in terms of its effects. Jacobites support the exiled Stuart line, James VII and II and his successors. But much more importantly than that, they actually stand for a different relationship between England, Scotland, and Ireland than the one that ultimately happened. They stand for a multi-kingdom monarchy, a composite monarchy, rather like Austria-Hungary, if you'd use the 19th century example, where you have 3 separate administrations, 3 separate governments, and effectively 3 separate courts, of which, of course, England's is the most powerful, but it's very different from the centralized British polity that ultimately displaced it. And so the support for the Jacobites is not ultimately a support solely or even mainly for a dynastic quarrel. It's for a different vision of the future, a more decentered British future and a more continental British future rather than a transatlantic one, if you like.
I also would add to that, if you talk even today in England, the word Jacobite means traitor. And also it's heavily associated with Catholicism, which I think is something that never ends in the whole story of Britain, actually. I have to say, I'm going to personally jump in here and say that I love the reference to Mark Twain, because when you were talking about that, I was thinking about his his famous trip to Scotland when he went and spat on the grave of Burns and blamed him personally for calling, on Scott for causing the Civil War. So strongly were his opinions felt on this issue. And actually, I have to say, speaking of strongly held opinions, just hearing you talk about this makes me correlate with today and with extreme nationalism and fascistic tendencies that we see going on around the world. It just is a reminder that things and humans never change. It's just the technology that does, that the base instincts of hate and exceptionalism just never go away, very sadly. So where can I get a roster of all the soldiers at Culloden, the clans, the English army members, and the Scottish who fought alongside the English? Can you answer that question?
So there isn't a full list of all British Army soldiers. We know how many there were, and you can recover it, but there isn't a full, easily accessible list. The muster roll of the Jacobite army in 1745-46 is the closest accessible list to the Jacobite army, but it does miss out an awful lot of people. If you because we don't have records for them, if you Google the database of the officers of the Jacobite armies, because I can't remember the URL just now, that's my database, not complete, but probably more complete than the muster roll of all officers who served in Jacobite armies from 1689 onwards. So anyone of the rank of 2nd lieutenant or higher.
Interesting. Thank you. Someone has written in to say that he was unaware of the Black Watch mutineers and the refusal to serve. Can you explain a bit more about what happened there?
So when the Black Watch were originally raised from the Scottish independent companies who were set up to promote British government interests in Scotland with some very substantial material rewards on show. I mean, they got very well paid and got very well equipped. And the nobleman who led them got, should we say, preferential access to power and influence. But they were raised on the basis they were raised for home defense. So when they were amalgamated into a regiment, that was still how they thought. And and it was indeed tacitly understood that they would only be used for home defense. So what happened when it was rumored that they were going to be sent to, guess what, the West Indies. In 1743, they mutinied and the ringleaders were executed. But one of the reasons that the Black Watch was never actually used by the British Army in the Jacobite Rising 2 years later was they just didn't trust them.
Of course, no, that makes perfect sense. I have to say, looking at the last batch of questions that have come in, I would say half of them are actually just comments. Wow, thank you, you're wonderful. So just to give you an aside, how much people are looking forward to buying the book and how much they enjoyed listening to you today. Annie asks, is there a geographical distinction between northern Scotland and the borders, or literally the coastal lowlands, or is it a cultural distinction regardless of topography?
So that's rather a big question. It's also a really good one because one of the things the book does say is that actually that the Highlands are partly a concept that's been introduced in British legislation since the middle of the 18th century. First of all, in the ruling over distilling and distilling duties in 1784. But so. Yes, there are differences, but basically the Scottish state, which is created, the pre-1707 Scottish state creates modern Scotland, is best understood as the closer you are to the heart of government in Edinburgh, the more it looks like a conventional state. And the further away you are, particularly with bad communication in the 17th and 18th centuries, out of reach of roads and so forth, the more it's diluted. So it becomes, if you see, the further west you go, the more it's like Ireland. Is really crude, but there are elements. I mean, Scotland's there like Ireland anyway. But the thing that actually differentiates it from Ireland in some ways more than anything else is the fact that it was a centralized European state of its own before it became, and so that's the outlier. Eastern Scotland, the borders, what's now the Central Belt, they're the outliers because they are actually the places where the Scottish state as a state was strongest.
Sandy asked if you can say more about the Scots who married into American Indian tribes.
So I can. They were one of the issues here was that Scots are very keen both on capturing high-end luxury goods. And if since they couldn't export many high-end luxury goods from Scotland, they got a habit, which had developed from the 16th century onwards, of capturing the export trade in luxury goods from markets that they went to, I would almost colonize, but their merchants set up shop in Rotterdam, in Hamburg, in Bergen, where they control most of the timber trade. But they also said in North America, this is highly relevant, they dominated the fur trade. And fur traders were the most likely to come in regular civil contact, and therefore and they had no bar to marrying. You see the same situation in British India, where before, when it's still the East India Company, before British power is exerted in the middle of the 19th century, Scots are very likely to marry Indians. They don't have nearly the same kind of cultural barrier because they're used to being culture receptive. So as I say, it's 4 times the level. And if you look at those Fort Vancouver figures, the sales in 1 year are about 1 mile of tartan to the First Nations buying their tartan from that one outlet.
That's astonishing. And actually, you say that, and I think that kind of receptiveness among the Scots still exists today. I have a number of Scottish friends who have married African Americans, and that I don't know a single white American that has married a Black American. Obviously there are many, but none that I know of. And I just find in general, there's just more of a receptiveness and an open-mindedness among the Scots toward all kinds of nationalities and toward intermarriage. Mary Ellen asks, can you discuss the relationship between early leadership roles by Scots, particularly governorships in the North American colonies, and subsequent choices made by those officials as either patriot or loyalism, and were those choices affected by the Jacobite risings?
Well, it's a huge question. I think the answer is sometimes they were. Sometimes they were affected by the Jacobite risings. Sometimes the officials themselves were probably covertly Jacobite and were semi-official in the sense that Oglethorpe was running. I won't say it was a private enterprise in Georgia, but he was a lot less tied to British government than, for example, the governor of New York would have been. So there are different aspects depending on the official, but most officials obviously take the British loyalist side, because that's what you do if you're in this senior role. It's your job. The interesting thing is, as with Murray of Dunmore, is the way that they do it. And the Ethiopian regiment is not just a piece of opportunism. It's actually a piece that you can see very bad behavior from Scots in this area, but you can also see good behavior. And it's a piece of the association of liberty with liberty for all, which is the point is being made in the raising of the Ethiopian regiment. It wasn't the last Black loyalist regiment raised, but it was the first, and it represented an interesting decision on Murray's part to not endorse the American Revolution, but to do so by actually criticizing one of the aspects of that revolution.
That's very, very nice segue, because we have a number of people who have asked about Lord Dunmore. And I will say before I ask you to expand on him that I believe he was a nasty piece of work. So can you tell us more about him?
Well, it's I suppose not a great deal more, in the sense that, but he was regarded, offhand, that is, the Ethiopian regiment was regarded as a real innovation by the British authorities, and one of the reasons that he got rewarded with the Bahamas, which is a much more major posting then than it appears to be now in the 1780s and 90s, was precisely because he felt he'd really not only done his best, but been very innovative in the policies he'd followed in the American War of Independence. So I don't have a view about his personality, except that he was well aware of the very different shades of politics that he lived through. But he was certainly, as with so many Scots, a little bit of a chameleon when it came to fulfilling his central goal, which is to get as many promotions and perquisites for himself as possible.
And I have to say, a nice tie-up to him would be the pineapple, which Professor Pittock mentioned, which is all that is left, actually, of the great house that he built at Dunmore. The house, of course, is gone. And the pineapple is owned by the National Trust of Scotland. You can visit it, but more excitingly, it is also operated by the Landmark Trust as a holiday let. So you can come and actually stay inside the pineapple, which is just like wicked cool. There are just so many questions coming in here. Carol asks, you mentioned about abolitionist ties, but wasn't a lot of Scottish wealth made from slavery and plantations in the West Indies? And were there strong abolitionist feelings in Scotland itself?
Yeah, so Scots are about, Scotland provides about a third of all the pro-abolition petitions in Great Britain, which is significantly ahead of population size at the beginning of the 19th century. So there was a lot of abolitionist feeling in Scotland. There was also a great deal of money made from enslavement in Scotland, and indeed throughout the imperial world. So I think one of the case studies I use in the book is Oswald Grant and Co., who bought the Banff Island at the mouth of the Sierra Leone River in West Africa, which the Royal Africa Company couldn't make pay, and they used it as a slave station with caddies, with their playing golf. They said laid out a golf course. They got their caddies to carry the golf clubs around wearing tartan, who were obviously enslaved persons, and then they shipped them off, and then they shipped them off, and then used the connections they made to the shipping to get the rights to supply provisions for the British Army in North America in 1756-63. So they had a more or less monopoly rights. They were supplying the army at inflated prices. And then, of course, Oswald was the British negotiator in the Treaty for the Peace of Paris in 1783. Much admired by Benjamin Franklin, a true good man in Franklin's view. Oswald was also a global slaver who died extremely rich.
Yes, and the thing is, of course, everything you're saying is just further proof that the more you delve into history, the more you come across gray areas. There's very little about any part of history that's black and white. There's very few very bad people. There's just subtleties of gray. And you actually gave me a very nice opening when you mentioned a bit of empire. A number of people have asked about how the Scots are seen as sort of the biggest drivers of the Victorian British Empire, and the fact that we wouldn't have actually had the empire we had without the Scots.
No, I think I do think the book makes the chapter and verse of that clear, and it's absolutely fair. And the major reasons are the innovations in steam, which led to Scotland becoming central to locomotive production. The innovations in seabound sea transport, which led to Scots controlling a large number of the largest shipping lines, and Scottish members of Parliament nakedly, as Thomas Sutherland did as MP for Greenock, feeding back commissions from P&O, which he also chaired, to his local shipyard.
What a coincidence!
Yeah, as no procurement rules at all. But so the story has gone into in considerable detail, but a lot of it rests on the fact that Scottish universities. There's a lot about Scottish education and networking, because networking tended to be local and institutional, and a bit after it was kinship based. An institutional network. So Scotland had too many institutions for a small country. Its institutions are huge for the scale of country it was. In the 18th century, there were more university places per capita than anywhere else in Europe. Drew people into strong networks, which were enhanced by the fact that often university professors, Lord Kelvin, William Thomson is a classic example, had many directorships outside, so that when Thomson got the technology right for laying underwater cable across the Atlantic, because of the interference there would be on just dumping the telegraph cable, and he came up with a technical solution for that. He also had significant investment interests in the companies which would benefit from it. And later on, he was responsible for a patronage system that staffed the Imperial College of Engineering in Japan and helped to facilitate the connections of Thomas Glover in Japan to purchase the FA-3 rangefinder for the Japanese Navy, which enabled them to sink the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait in 1905.
The Russo-Japanese War, yes. I'm just sort of gobsmacked and my breath taken away by the scope of your knowledge and the fact that you can just sort of like recite it, just sort of like purge it out there, just at the drop of a hat. It's astonishing. And unfortunately, I have to end it there because that's all the time we have for questions today. You can ask us questions that we can forward on to Professor Pittock, if you'd like, at heritagetours@nehgs.org. And I have to thank everybody for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated, particularly with wonderful speakers like this. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay Scottish, and I hope to see you soon on our future programs. Goodbye for now.